Wow, look at all these people.
Hello, everyone.
Good morning. Please mute yourselves.
Hello, everybody. Benham from Sydney.
Hi, Bam. Please mute yourselves as you come in.
I don't want people to see me out here.
No.
Please mute yourself as you come in. Please mute yourselves as you come in.
C'è Davide Razzini, 4.
No, credo che ci sia di più, ma...
Ah, 114. Vediamo.
Please mute yourselves as you come in.
Sto sbagliato che c'era ancora un po' di vetro dentro il sacchetto, ma ho preso il sacchetto, l'ho buttato dentro la carta e addio al vetro. Però non penso che per questa...
Com'è che fai a vedere i partecipanti? No, com'è che fai a vedere i partecipanti?
Hello.
Hello,
Hello, please mute yourselves. Welcome.
my name is Moses Kigo.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm Ethan from Australia, Adelaide.
Yes, thank you. Please mute yourselves. People are still coming in. Christine?
Yeah.
You can begin.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So welcome from myself, Christine Harland, and the rest of the team, who I'll introduce to you, to this open forum we've called an action agenda for effective post-COVID-19 supply chain management. We greatly appreciate the time you're committing in joining us for what we hope will be an interesting and informative exploration into considering what supply chain management could be like in the future. The purpose of this event is to stimulate ideas that can be shared during and after the forum, as we will theme and pull together the contributions into a report we'll share with you all in 2 weeks' time. We're not reporting names and organisations, so please speak freely. This open forum isn't a webinar, and it isn't about so-called experts saying how supply chain management should be done. We live in uncertain times, and now we all need humility to share ideas and work out together how we move forward. This forum is an open gathering for your comments, questions, concerns, and problems. Problems we really need to solve as academics and practitioners in supply chain management. With around 500 registered online participants, we won't be able to open up discussion across the entire group, but instead you can add your comments and chat using the participants chat feature in Zoom. Those who are joining us in YouTube live feed, you can live chat. Remember, please be respectful in the live chat. And please be patient. We're all getting used to new online platforms for meeting virtually, and this is a big beast of a meeting. We don't have IT teams backing us up here, so anything can happen. So as you will see in the program, we have 3 speakers who will each give As you will see in the program, we have 3 speakers who will each give a short conversation starter to get our forum going. But we also have guest speakers who will pop in during the event. Our opening speakers are Lisa Elrom, who is Reese Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management in the Farmer School of Business in Miami University, Ohio, USA, and is a former editor of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. Barbara Flynn is Richard M. and Myra Louise Buskirk Professor of Manufacturing Management at the Kelley School of Business, Indianapolis in the USA, and is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. Gyun-Yi Kovacs is Urco Professor in Humanitarian Logistics at Hong Kong School of Economics and co-editor of the Journal of Humanitarian Logistics and Supply Chain Management. Our organisers also include Joe Sarkis, who is Professor at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute and is working behind the scenes during the forum, managing your incoming comments and questions with Wendy Tate, who is William J. Taylor Professor of Business at the University of Tennessee in the USA and is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Purchasing and Supply Management. And I'm Christine Harland, Gianluca Spina Chair in Supply Strategy, Politecnico di Milano, Italy, former editor of the Journal of Purchasing and Supply Management. And I'm going to be trying my hardest to moderate this event over the coming about 90 minutes. So let's spend a couple of minutes on housekeeping and how the forum will work. First, before we start with our speakers, may I ask you please to keep your mobile phones and your microphones on mute until we call on you to contribute, and then unmute your microphone. If you know you're going to speak, please stay with us as the running order is dynamic. So you could be called in at any time during the forum. Second, this version of Zoom is set up as a massive online meeting, which doesn't allow for a smooth Q&A session with upvoting of questions, etc. So for the discussion portion of the forum, we're going to use a free website called onlinequestions.org. I'm posting the link in the chat box now. Here's what you need to do. Click on the link to onlinequestions.org. And you might want to write this down. Enter the event number 42020. That's 4 for April 2020 in the audience member box and click enter. Post your questions and comments on the event page and upvote the topics that you want to discuss. So you can click on them and vote. Please use the default yellow cards for comments, green cards for questions, light blue for offers, and dark blue for asks. Please write your name somewhere in the question comment field if you want to speak. That way we can call on you. We're allowing about 45 questions for each speaker, so please be concise. Occasionally, we will feature a guest we have invited to speak for a little longer. If you do wish to speak, you can also raise your hand virtually in the participants box. We will try to get to as many people who wish to speak as we can, but we apologize if we cannot get to you. At least please do use the chat to provide your comments. The forum is also being streamed live on YouTube. You'll find it at the following address, posted now in the Zoom chat. So you should see an address in the Zoom chat for the live YouTube. So before we start the forum, we're going to have our speakers, and we're going straight through our speakers without inviting Q&A at this point. Our first speaker is Lisa Elrom, who's going to introduce some supply side aspects of how supply chain management might change. Lisa.
That would help if I was unmuted. So thank you very much for being here today. I hope you're healthy, you're social distancing. So I want to talk about sort of how we got to where we are right now. And one of the things that I think has really driven the magnitude of our current situation in supply chains with COVID-19 is the cost obsession that people in supply chain face in their day-to-day jobs. So I'm going to focus on short-term cost and profit issues and some of the practices that support that. I really think that we have cost cut our way into the severity of the current supply chain situation. So in pursuit of higher profits to appease the stock market, increase share prices, and feed top management bonuses, many companies have really gone overboard in reducing their cost at the expense of being agile. And lean principles, I love lean principles, but these really took hold in the late 1980s and early 1990s when companies saw how successful that the Japanese were. And lean principles are wonderful. They're universal in many cases because they encourage people to reduce waste. And you can see they look at things like defects, over-processing, not having too much motion, things like that, and really utilizing your staff talent. And all of those things I think are really good. But a basic assumption of lean principles is that demand is known and predictable. And that means if you knew what was going to happen with demand, you really don't need inventory. And overproduction, producing more than you need right now, is a problem. However, I think pretty much no one will deny that lean systems have left us really unprepared for large changes in demand and the supply interruptions that we're seeing right now. In the US and so much of the world, inventory levels are very, very low because it saves operating costs, it saves on money, and it considers that if you don't have much inventory, your warehousing cost is going to be significantly lower. You're not going to have to be throwing away inventory. Inventory is not going to be out of date. So there's a lot of good reasons for doing this, and it seems like the best way to go until your supply chain is actually interrupted. Now, another thing that's really exacerbated this has been the move to low-cost country sourcing. So, sorry, I'm controlling this a little, the slides. So the low-cost country sourcing, this really took hold sort of in the late 1990s when China began to open up its economy to manufacturing. And I'll never forget in 1999, when I was in a meeting with the head of purchasing for a large global aerospace company. He had just gotten back from China. He was so excited about his trip. And he told me, he goes, I asked them about how much, what their pricing would be. And their response was, how much are you willing to pay? So, and I had visited China just a few years before that on vacation, and I'd seen the level of poverty there. And I really understood that any contribution towards their labor would be a huge help to the Chinese government and the people. But I also understood that the business would come at the expense of local sourcing, and it would come at the expense of jobs that were paying a living wage. So we around the world, we all got into this low cost sourcing. We lengthened our supply chains, adding 6 weeks, 8 weeks, even 12 weeks of response time, ocean shipping products. And for most industries though, those really, really low prices seem to make up for it. Now, as our supply chains grew longer, what happened was that we started to really leverage our volume as well. So we started to concentrate with fewer sources because the sources were so inexpensive and it was difficult to manage a lot of sources at a great distance. We had very limited local backup. And once we started to lose our local sourcing, we no longer had as much visibility into everything that was going on in the supply chain. We didn't know who our suppliers were. But we were getting, the quality was improving and things were going well. So as a result, what we did was we started to focus even more on cost and moving out into additional low-cost countries. So adding to this squeeze was our fixation on financial statements, which really came to a head during the recession of 2008 and 2009. And the stock market loves companies that have strong balance sheets. Strong balance sheets means that you have low inventory, and it also means that you have a lot of cash. So what did we do? During the last recession, we continued to push more inventory out to our suppliers or just reduce inventory altogether in the supply chain. And we extended our payment terms so that now we were using somebody else's cash. So both of these things make our balance sheet look strong, but they make our supply chains a lot less able to respond when something goes wrong. So essentially, we're in the middle of this right now, and I think there's a great opportunity to learn from it. And we have to learn where we can't afford to be lean and where we need to be more agile and responsive. These are conscious choices that companies need to make, and they're not going to be the same in every industry. So we need to look at where backup is needed and what types of industries need to be more agile, what types of industries really should focus more on having more inventory. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what the next speakers have to say about how they believe we should address these issues today. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm turning it back to Christine now.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And we're moving straight through all of our speakers without Q&A to leave as much space as we can then for the forum. So we're moving now to our second speaker, who is Barbara Flynn. who will get us all thinking about what supply chains can be doing right now and how they can prepare for future global crises. Barbara. We need to unmute Barbara.
Sorry. Okay. So first, take care of your suppliers. They need you. Things are going to get better at some point. And when they do, you're going to need to have suppliers that are A, still in business, and B, willing to make your business their top priority. They're hurting, maybe worse than your company is. So what can you do to help your suppliers? Well, first, keep on making purchases if you can, even if your plants aren't currently operating. If you buy even a fraction of your normal purchases, that's going to help your suppliers a lot. And you can always hold the parts in inventory to smooth out your purchases when things get better. If you're currently operating, improve your payment terms to incorporate a quicker payment cycle. When things get better, your suppliers are going to remember that. And maybe you're going to need a favor from your suppliers in the future. Next slide. Second, so yeah, next, oh, go back one, please. Back. There we go. Second, understand your entire supply chain. You can probably easily name who your suppliers are, or your key suppliers anyway, but who are their suppliers? And who are your suppliers' suppliers? Where are they located? So think about an example here, the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear power plant meltdown in Japan. It's another example of a situation that was just inconceivable before it happened. So next slide, please. Toyota's pre-earthquake supply chain structure resembled a set of pyramids. Toyota interacted directly with a small number of first-tier suppliers, which I'm showing as T1A and T1B here, but there were actually about 15 of them. And they were responsible for selecting and managing suppliers so that Toyota could concentrate on its own strategic priorities. So when the earthquake hit, Toyota didn't even know who its lower suppliers were. And it took a week for it to list all of its suppliers and then assess which were the most severely damaged. Worse, it discovered that although it believed its suppliers were arranged in a pyramid structure, it was actually more like a barrel structure. So next slide, please. All of Toyota's first-tier suppliers purchased their critical microcontroller units from the same supplier, unbeknownst to Toyota. And of course, that supplier had been completely destroyed during the earthquake. This critical supplier was at the 4th or 5th tier in each of the pyramids. And because of that, it was invisible to Toyota, which never would have allowed this sole sourcing if it had known about it. So the moral of this story is know what your supply chain structure looks like. Is it more like a pyramid or more like a barrel? And if your supply chain has a barrel structure, what are you doing to deal with the potential for damage to those critical common suppliers? Next slide. Third, think about how you can develop a more resilient supply chain that is first, less vulnerable to disruptions, and second, more capable of handling disruptions when they do occur. One of the keys that we often think about is developing redundant suppliers, always having a backup supplier. And I think this was very common practice prior to COVID-19. But I also suspect that many companies had both their primary suppliers and their backup suppliers located in China. And we were all surprised when manufacturers in China stopped working, although it seems not at all surprising now as things have changed so fast. So until then, we had never thought about the possibility of an entire country being closed down. But this is a new world. So it's going to be important to look at geographic diversity when we're developing backup suppliers, not have them all in the same place. Next slide, please. Fourth, think about bringing some of your manufacturing capabilities back onshore and in-house. And this dovetails really nicely with Lisa's discussion of supply chain cost obsession. So many companies were obsessed with costs, but it should be obvious now that the most important priority of manufacturing should be to keep on manufacturing. But because so many manufacturers outsourced some or all of their production offshore, they lost the capability to produce those items themselves. So these capabilities include things like worker skills, equipment, blueprints, and that tribal culture that's embedded in our knowledge, that's embedded in organizational culture. In some cases, domestic companies haven't had these capabilities for as long as 10 or 15 years. So if we had the ability to produce the necessary parts ourselves now, many companies wouldn't be in such a dire situation. So as you plan for the future, think about developing your own internal capabilities and reshoring some of your production. Will this cost more than offshoring to a low-cost country? Undoubtedly. But the real trade-off to think about is whether it's better to have low-cost suppliers that aren't able to deliver the parts or the capability to continue your operations. So don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting bringing your entire supply chain in-house, but what I'm suggesting is to assess what capabilities you have internally and think about what you can do to develop needed capabilities in the next years to prepare for the next crisis, whatever it is. Next slide. And finally, always be thinking about unexpected disasters that we never could have conceived of in the past. For example, a few years ago, what would we have said the potential was for an earthquake followed by a tsunami, followed by a nuclear power plant meltdown, or the potential for a global pandemic? Who knows what the next supply chain crisis is going to be, especially if it's something we never could have possibly anticipated. So for this reason, it's important to think about the supply chain impact of a crisis rather than focusing on the probability of any specific crisis. Next slide, please. So let me give you an example. I live in a part of the United States where earthquakes never happen, so we don't even consider the possibility of an earthquake in our supply chain planning. However, in 1811, as these sketches show, there was a devastating 8.2 magnitude earthquake in this part of the country. It remains the most powerful earthquake ever to hit the contiguous United States east of the Rocky Mountains. Now, luckily, as the pictures show, this part of the US was the frontier then, so there was very little limited damage to buildings or loss of life. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a different earthquake, 6.8, which was much smaller, that happened in 1895. And look at the region that was impacted. 8.2 would have impacted, to some extent, most of the country. So if something like this happened today, the damage to manufacturers would be absolutely devastating. But because this earthquake happened in 1811, manufacturers who use suppliers in this part of the country never even think about the possibility of an earthquake. Next slide, please. So to deal with unanticipated disasters, next slide. To deal with unanticipated disasters, we need to focus on the supply chain impact of removing a node from a supply network. If you think of this network diagram as being something that looks like a supply network. So rather than thinking about the probability of an earthquake or a fire or something, think about what would happen if a specific supplier was removed. Next slide, please. So what would happen, for example, if this supplier was damaged and therefore removed from the supply network for any reason? How would we ensure continuity of business if that happened? What about the other nodes? So through this kind of analysis, removing nodes and looking at what the implications would be for our supply chain, we can identify what are the most critical nodes in our supply networks and begin developing contingency plans for dealing with unanticipated disasters. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your discussion and insights.
Thanks very much, Barbara. And now we move to our third and final speaker, who is Gyungyi Kovacs, who will turn our attention to the downstream logistics side of supply chains and lessons from humanitarian supply chains. Gyungyi.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that what you've heard so far was a lot about the supply chain implications of any kind of disaster, but there are, of course, a lot of supply chains that deal with disasters, deal with supply chain risk management as their basically everyday activity. So this is why I wanted to start with issues in humanitarian logistics and humanitarian supply chain management. Now, typically people think and consider humanitarian logistics mostly in natural disasters. That said, in fact, a lot more activity in humanitarian logistics has to do with conflict zones. And also there's quite a lot that pertains to responding to epidemics and all sorts of outbreaks. This is the map that you see here from yesterday from Relief Web, which looks at and basically monitors any kind of ongoing disasters and also puts up alerts of disasters. Now, what you will see in this map that there are quite a few epidemics, and this is now not considering COVID-19, that are currently on the radar and that are currently being responded to around the globe. And we do have quite a lot to learn from how we've been responding already to a lot of these epidemics and what we can do or cannot do due to those. There's also a bit of a hope there, because if you think of it, supply chains are not just impacted, but supply chain management to some extent can be the answer to how we are actually dealing with epidemics. And if you look at all these organizations working here, you'll find that if you really think about it, you probably know quite a few medical humanitarian organizations that are really specialized in these kinds of endeavors, that send out field hospitals, that work in epidemic zones, and so forth. So I'm sure that you've heard quite a lot from those as well. Next slide, please. Now, what do we already know? In fact, we do know quite a lot about these. And we know, for example, that preparedness pays off. There has been a really good study and very detailed study by the CUNY Logistics University together with Help Logistics, where they quantified and really looked at how preparedness pays off. And they found a ratio of €1 that you put into preparedness equals €7 in response. The same goes for any kind of currency. So if you live in the States, think of dollars by all means. Now, what does preparedness mean? Preparedness does not only mean having pre-positioned stock around the globe. It does mean that too. Definitely, it does mean that you identify what's going to be critical for a next disaster, for a next outbreak, and have those kinds of items. For example, personal protective equipment is one of those kinds of items. But it also means, preparedness also means that you have training for particular disasters, that you keep your skills up, that you have teams that you can send out and respond together, that you have coordination mechanisms and agreements on who is going to do what when you come to, for example, a disasters area. So it's a lot of other things as well that preparedness can mean, but probably first and foremost, when you talk about inventory management, as Lisa pointed out, preparedness does also mean preparedness stock. Now, we do need to think not just in terms of leanness, but also in terms of agility, flexibility, responsiveness, resilience. And we've been talking about it also in commercial supply chains for decades by now, about all of these concepts. So it's more a question of just putting them into action. But what do we also know, which are important issues to learn for our current outbreak as well? One is there is a lot of interdependencies of medical deliveries. So there are medical kits when it comes to delivering to particular pandemics. There are kits for testing kits. There are interdependencies of drugs to syringes, how to administer drugs, and so forth. So, and we've seen now a lot of these kinds of shortcomings that even though certain things have been delivered, a particular, say, a swab was missing to administer tests. So thinking of these kinds of kits does help also in responding to pandemics. And in fact, that's what humanitarian organizations have been doing quite a lot. There are interagency health kits that are for particular different types of disasters, which can range from very small ones, say smallish ones for a cholera outbreak, to large field hospitals as a kit, in fact. So thinking of those kitting and packaging experiences, that helps a lot. Another thing we know is that this is a heavily regulated industry. So it's not in the very last minute that you can import a drug or a medical equipment from somewhere. There are huge regulations, drug lists, customs clearance regulations. A number of items here that we are dealing with need temperature control. Quality regulations are huge, but also what is kind of interesting here, when now everybody is looking at producing their own, for example, face masks, there are minimal standards one needs to follow also for those. And those standards exist, and the World Health Organization has come out with them and is updating them all the time. So you'll find them actually online. Then also we need special material handling permits when we are handling drugs or medical equipment. So it's not everybody in a warehouse who can deal with those, which is probably not something to be forgotten here. Another thing we know from previous disasters, and now I'm talking of experiences, say, from the Ebola outbreak, is that if you have travel bans or quarantines, it also will impact on the delivery of cargo. To the extent that sometimes airplanes will just not fly to certain zones and the belly cargo is gone, or the truck drivers refuse to go somewhere, or that you would have the issue that even though you might be able to deliver something, the people who delivered it will not be let out of the quarantine zone again. So these have implications for how we deal with these kinds of crises as well. Next slide, please. Now, what do we know about this particular crisis? We know that there's a global shortage of medical equipment. It's not news to us. Every single country and every single outbreak area is struggling with that. We know that we will need to increase the capacity, the production capacity of many of these kinds of materials and come up with innovative and quick ways to increase those capacities. We also do know that there are quality issues with particular products that have been going around. Plus there are rumors of what you need or what you don't need. Please don't start eating garlic as one of the responses to dealing with this outbreak. But then in terms of the logistical aspects of it, we know that logisticians are also heavily impacted by the impact of COVID-19. They are very much exposed to the disease itself because they do deliver in the last mile. And I'll come to last mile deliveries in a second. We don't have very good data on it. We have a bit of anecdotal evidence to the extent that the anecdotal evidence we have is scarily showing us how they were impacted by the disease. But let's hope that that is still not completely correct. We also know that there are lots of issues with export bans, travel bans, bullwhipping, speculative pricing, trying to outbid one another for the same materials and so forth. To the extent that we have new trade wars pretty much going on with this. It doesn't help anyone. It also doesn't necessarily help to just have autonomous production. It might just help a little bit more to really learn here from the coordinated humanitarian efforts that humanitarian organizations have in other areas. I wanted to highlight a project that we've just started off in this regard because we have a new EU project with a lot of different, of course, organizations involved, which is Project Heroes. There we are looking at the security of medical supplies, but we also look at the impact of COVID-19 outbreak on supply chain disruptions, and through that and through cascades in the supply chain and across sectors, how that will impact on our economy, globally speaking. Next slide, please. Last but not least, obviously, as last mile deliveries go, I wanted to highlight a few things here. One is that last mile deliveries we deal with, and this is something that we see that every industry currently, not just the medical supply chains, but also food supply chains, everything else, have to consider. How do we get our items to anyone in need, especially in quarantines, especially people who are not allowed to exit their homes? So we now see that from a transportation perspective as well, it's not just about points of delivery and the routing questions that we typically consider, but now we really have to think about, say, public health observations. How does social distancing impact on how we actually manage this last mile delivery? What does it mean for our picking lines and packing lines, for the number of workers we have? How do we isolate certain different picking lines, or how do we isolate, say, food production, kitchen lines versus the delivery people? There are lots of innovations coming in this field as well. It's a fascinating field to watch. Maybe just as a very last point I wanted to make, logistics is an essential industry in a pandemic, and it's very important we keep on talking about it and that we find solutions that work for everyone. Thank you for your attention so far. Back to questions probably later, and back to Christine in the meantime.
Thanks very much, Jianyu. So as speakers, we've started with introducing supply side, the upstream side. We've looked at manufacturing, and then we've looked at logistics and the downstream side. That's just one way that we could have approached it to start. But now we want to begin the open forum portion of this session. We already see that you've been busy in chat and the comments are growing. Thank you very much. What we've been doing before the event and we're continuing to do during the event is we identified a number of themes from your comments and your questions. So the themes that we're addressing today, these are driven by you. So we're going to try to spend some time on each theme. So we're going to have some short comments and questions posed by people. We are asking you please to be concise and think of 45 seconds for a contribution, please, to be able to involve as many people as we can in this open forum. So we'll identify people with comments or questions. So listen for your name. I will call you by name. And then if you wish to speak on a theme, you can virtually raise your hand in the participant window. As one person is answering, commenting, others can contribute by virtually raising their hand or adding comments into either the Zoom comment section or on the live YouTube comment section. We're going to try to have as many comments and questions as possible, but there's more than one way to participate. And all of these contributions are all going to be gathered together and analysed for the report. So please do contribute. So now let's start the forum. And we're starting by thinking initially about the current problems and the current issues relating to manufacturing, distribution capacity, supply shortages, lack of global capacity in supply markets, supply chains locked down. All of these are forming a theme of the situation right now, this minute. So relating to the current situation, then we've got some contributions already that we've highlighted. Paolo Caminati asked specifically about manufacturing strategy and what will that look like? So Paolo, would you like to comment? Do we have Paolo?
Paolo may not be here. Some people may not be here.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on and we'll come back if Paolo can join us at some time. We had Paolo, who talked about distribution. Are you there, Piero? And would you like to comment? This is working terribly well. So we'll come back. It's going to be slow to get this all started, but we'll come back and please signal if you're there, Piero, and we'll come back to you. So we have some other contributions on the current situation. I know that Jean Schneller has got particular concerns about the current situation relating to healthcare supply chains. Are you there, Jean, to be able to comment? So we don't seem to be getting these contributions in yet. Let's move to Alexandre Gay, who is from Colgate Palmolive, who's a plant manager, who has some insights and is facing current issues relating to these concerns. Are you there, Alexandre, to comment?
Yes, thank you.
Hurrah!
So I will talk about two things. One is handle at the current crisis. I think one thing that helped us working in a 200 years company is about crisis management pre-preparation. So we are very much using it now. And another thing that is part of it is how did we empower the local teams to make decisions, to leverage action and be faster on reacting to the crisis. On that point, we are using the global connection that we have in our company, since we have operations in more than 200 areas worldwide. So we manage the crisis, we empower local teams, but we have as well weekly forums with the global supply chain teams where we do benchmarks and we do cross-fertilization of decisions and how we are handling the situation. And as well, one thing that gives a lot of confidence to us on how do we manage the situation is following the point that we have three very simple objectives on this crisis management. One is business continuity. The following one is safety for our employee. The third one is helping the communities around us. So with these three pillars, we are handling this situation, which make the goals very much clear and objective. The second point I wanna talk is, sorry, do we talk about the change for the future now, or we wait for this question?
I think it'd be really helpful, thank you, Alexandre, just to get a few thoughts currently about what's happening, and then maybe we can come back to start to think about the future, if that's okay.
Yeah, so okay. No, please go ahead.
So do you have anything else that you wanted to add about the current situation, particularly relating to Brazil?
Not additional to what I have shared. So be simple, be structured, empower local teams, be effective on communication, and use the global network that you have.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So we'll come back to some of those future issues as we move through, because we're going to think about these current issues currently, and then we're going to think about how people are dealing with these in the short to medium term, and we're going to think then about the longer term picture for supply chain management. So we have a comment from Arnie Halldorson, which is about the current issues for several companies who are in lockdown and how this is affecting. So Arnie Halldorson, do you want to make your comment?
Sorry, Christine, I was just plugging in. Could you please repeat your question?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, you were making a point about the current issue for several companies that you're working with, is that there's this total lockdown, and
yeah,
about how you start and recover. So I wondered if you could just make that point and expand on it a little. Thank you.
Yeah, it feels like we are living in a twilight zone now. Some of the sectors we're working with are not affected at all, like energy utilities. Others need to scale up, others need to slow down, and there are all the big companies basically closing down. And there the question is, how do we recover and start up again? We have some experience from 2008, the crunch, yet many of the people involved in the recovery at that point of time are not working in the organizations anymore. So there's a lack of competence, lack of driving force, lack of ideas and frameworks to kick us off going again. So resilience, lean, and these ideas, yeah, these are in a way we are for some companies beyond these. We are talking about really big, important companies that usually are our lab. They are just closed now.
Yeah.
No one to contact whatsoever, and no one knows how to start up again and what happens when we begin again.
Thank you. And related to that, I know we were trying to get hold of Jean Schneller, and I know that Jean Schneller has got particular issues about this and all of the healthcare supply chains. Jean's messaged me to say if we unmute him, he can contribute. So is it possible to get Jean's contribution? Can we unmute Jean? No, we're still having a problem with Eugene. Let's come back.
I don't see Eugene's name in the site. What name is he using?
Jean Schneller, I assume.
Under G?
G for Jean, probably.
No.
Or Eugene, E. If not, let's come back. Let's keep looking for you, Jean. We know you're there. You're emailing me. Let's move to Shoat Ibrahim, who has got a comment to make on this. Can we hear your comment?
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I have a comment related to the mapping of global value chains and the effects that were mentioned, I think, by Lisa about nearshoring and bringing back some of the sourcing. Maybe if in the short term to solve some issues, there will be local qualification of suppliers, alternative substitution material. How do we, if someone can study again how this, the new norm after this, the effects of resourcing and how things mapped out for certain industries, I think it does have to be industry based. So that'll be very interesting for the people who have already spent some time tracking first tier and second tier suppliers across global value chains. It has implications, I think, on some effort that's been done on multi-tier sustainability, because I mean, if you're not sustainable enough to provide products in a situation like this, you can't track where things are beyond, the pyramid or the barrel. Thank you, Barbara, for that. The barrel is very interesting. So the shape of the network, the shape of the value chain. The thing is, I think as individual are done for their company's best interest. How does that flat out for the whole global value chain? The relationship back and forth between that.
So some really good points there. Thank you very much, relating to really understanding, building on Barbara's comments about really understanding the structure of networks that we have been dealing with and really thinking about those. But I think you're absolutely right that a lot of organizations don't really understand those structures, and they haven't invested in understanding of some sectors. And you've said that sector-specific studies are needed. And I think that's right. Some sectors are really very good at understanding their supply networks, and others have paid less attention. So, and they're understanding that now because they just really are struggling to see what's happening. Do we have any other comments relating to this current situation?
Jean, is that your phone number?
Yeah, sorry, we're really trying to get Jean Schneller in, who's done a lot of work on healthcare supply chains.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Hi, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Thank you. For some reason, I was muted up until now.
Hi.
So hi, I'm sorry. That is great. Let me give a little different perspective from the healthcare system in the United States. I've been suggesting that we are having the perfect storm that we asked for in the United States. And let me just give you about 6 or 7 points. One is the United States has gone through a period of mergers and acquisitions in the healthcare system, and it's reduced significantly the number of actors. But these systems have been very large, and as they've been very large, as Lisa pointed out initially and Christine, they become very cost focused. And CEOs in these mergers have begun to see supply chain as a revenue center where every dollar saved contributes to the bottom line. And that comes through outsourcing, it comes through just a variety of other things, moving to lean. One of the things that we've done is we have moved many procedures outside the hospital. We have one of the shortest lengths of stay in the country, and we've developed a lot of outpatient procedures, which means that hospitals have been unprepared for the surge. We probably have we do have one of the lowest ratios of hospital beds to population in the world, whereas countries like Japan and South Korea have very high ratios. The other thing we've done is we've really not paid a lot of attention to the human resource supply chain, and we haven't spoken much of that today. We have very strict scopes of practice, which means that workers within the hospital aren't agile, and they're not trained to do functions across each other. We've also outsourced a great deal of our purchasing to large group purchasing organizations and distributors, which means that the accountability has been pushed from the hospital systems to a small number of large GPOs, as well as a large number or small number of suppliers. And those suppliers clearly have not done their due diligence in the contract or the outsourced group purchasing organizations. I would argue with you have sort of failed to do their due diligence in having a sourcing structure that would deal with something like a pandemic. In addition, and just two more quick points, we have had a separation of personal health care from public health. I don't think that's unique to the United States. I think Christine would argue that the UK has done the same in its attempt to bring down costs in the National Health Service. But those two supply chains rarely talk to each other. And as was pointed out, that the regulatory environment hasn't been prepared for change to be able to do things. So if you take that push toward lean in healthcare, and although many supply chain directors or vice presidents have been moved to the executive suite, their accountability has been almost uniquely around price, not their contribution to clinical outcomes. So two quick comments. One is the hospital is probably the most resource dependent of any organization you can think of. They produce almost nothing of what they use. And secondly, the idea of a commons has totally collapsed. In the United States, each hospital is out on its own trying to source ventilators. Governor Cuomo in New York seems to understand the commons idea better than others as he tries to bring the states together to share ventilators and to share other PPE items. But from a, if you go back and think about the tragedy of the commons, hospitals all over the country are hoarding materials, and those materials fail to contribute where they're needed and when they're needed, and will contribute to more of a collapse. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Jean. You made so many valuable comments. Some of the comments that you're making, we've already got a theme. We're going to pick them on later relating to, I was very interested in what you were saying about the cross-functional working and in terms of the ability within the supply chains to be far more flexible on that. So we have a theme that we'll move on to later, which is looking at some of these management issues. Some of these other issues that you're raising, then there's significant differences between countries, depending on their structure and the way that their healthcare is structured. The US healthcare sector, whereas in other countries more of a centrally controlled healthcare system. And we do have other people on the line who might be able to come in and comment on that, because this issue about this materials and the situation that we're in with these materials, it's very challenging to be able to bring in new suppliers in the short term, to be able to see if we can break some of these supply chain problems. And I know that Michael Murphy has got a comment relating to this and about some of these regulation difficulties. Michael, can you comment?
Yes, thank you, Christine. It was an offhand comment specifically related to the difficulties in the medical supply chain of certifying new suppliers or even certifying non-standard products for use in an emergency. I'm thinking about personal protective equipment in particular. The example in the United States, as everyone knows, and as Jean just mentioned, we have these critical shortages of, for example, masks, the N95 masks. Globally, particularly in Asia, KN95 is considered functionally equivalent, and there are larger supplies of these masks available, but they cannot be used in the United States because they are not certified as as equivalent. And so the question is, even if we can get access to supplies, is there a way to speed up the regulatory process, or is that above our pay grade when we discuss supply chains? So I see this more as a regulatory question than even a supply chain one.
And I think this is where the regulatory side of supply chain management becomes really important to us. And we are seeing, as you're rightly saying, relating to some of these personal protective equipment supply chains, the regulatory issues, but also we're already familiar with the really longer time scales relating to then bringing in, whether they're new tests or new vaccines. So, and internationally, that's very, very different. So I think one of the things that we can start to highlight is some of these international differences, if we have other people on the line that can comment on that. So we have issues about all of the critical items, the medical items, the personal protective equipment, but there's also critical items relating to food and food supply chains. And we have seen variability internationally about shortages and concerns growing about longer term shortages in some countries. So we have a comment from Mark Andrew Smith about these food supply chains and when they might gain some normality again. Can you make a comment on that? Mark Andrew Smith?
Yeah, so I'm based in Australia, and certainly a supply chain which predominantly is homegrown, shall I say, particularly in the food sector. I work in supermarkets and operations, and certainly from what we've seen at the moment, we're experiencing incredible shortages where A, we can't get raw materials to our suppliers in the first place, but B, where we've got products abroad that are stuck in quarantine and can't be released. So I think about pasta, flour. So we're seeing on average kind of 1,000% increase in store accountable gaps within stores at the moment, which of course is then driving further demand from consumers who can't see products on shelf. So that psychological element as well is creating some real challenges for us. Then with the lockdown we're experiencing as well, is flooding the market with fruit and veg. We're seeing more of that hitting the local markets, which is being picked up by supermarkets. So we have an influx of fresh foods and not enough of our staple grocery items coming through the kind of global supply. So that's the real challenges we're facing at the moment here in Australia.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Yeah, and we're hearing from all over the world some of the issues longer term about inability to be able to get crops picked, and so concerns about how long some of these issues in some of these critical supply chains are going to continue for. We want to start to bring in now some of these immediate responses of where organizations are being able to respond and try to learn how that can be. So if we start to think about how some of these supply chains can be very agile and flexible, and Andrea Apollini has brought up the idea about organizations that are really showing true agility and flexibility. And we're seeing some organizations being very quick to be able to respond. So can we call on, is Andrea here to comment on that?
Hi, my name is Andrea Polloni from Rome, Italy. And thank you very much. And I would like to focus my attention on back reshoring. And we are starting a project here in Italy, especially for the fashion industry. And it's a very crucial sector, and probably could be a good occasion to relocate some production inside the country. Another good topic is public procurement. And we have a lot of problem to buy medical products in public sector. And we are starting another project to make in emergency and very fast the online tender to certify immediately suppliers, not only local supplier, but international supplier. There are some problems about masks, and we know that the majority of masks are produced in China and in other countries. And this is my opinion from Italy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Andrea. Yes, I did see that Italy was particularly quick at responding and relaxing some of its public procurement rules, and that was published just a couple of weeks ago in the Lancet, a medical journal. So there's international recognition of the response that's being made in some countries to be able to free some of this regulatory and public procurement logjam. There's also, so we're thinking here then about how we're seeing this response, this flexibility, and some of these capabilities. And we have a comment on this from Seum Berkey. Are you there, Seum?
Yes, Christine. Hello. Thank you very much. I have been working with colleagues in Italy and here in Sweden, working on this flexibility and agility. And the initial speeches also well recognized about the issues of agility and lean and how companies reflected on that and how they approached it. And I think one key issue also that I could reflect connecting to the comments that have been written here in this forum is that no matter how good your organization or established it is, it's now obvious, well, it has been established already in the research, of course, it's obvious that nobody knows what is going to happen in the next round of crisis or disruption situation. And therefore, what seems to be making better result is how flexible you are at different levels, both at strategic level, but also at tactical levels. So at strategic level, trying to turn around what your targets or bottom lines are and how you approach about keeping all your relationships and continuing to operate and so on, but also at tactical level, if demanded, to change your production line into something else so that you would be able to produce something else which is needed, and ultimately you have a value that can be driven because you will have customers of a different sort. So I think in many situations, this message already was there because there were papers from different researchers from Georgia Tech, for example, or from US, Joe Sarkis was also writing on these areas. I have read some of the papers. And if you collectively look at them, the two dimensions, one is redundancy and the other one is the flexibility issue. So from the redundancy point of view, one could argue that having, for example, stocks or inventory could help you, but some other one may also argue the same way, like if your pipeline or your warehouse is part of the quarantine area, for example, you wouldn't have access even if you have accumulated it. And ultimately, it comes back to having the flexibilities to change your routes, your channels, and so on. So I think I took much time, and it seems this way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. So it's a really good comment that's looking at the strategic and the tactical aspects then of flexibility. Some companies have already got skills for that. Now, this is raising an awful lot of attention. So can we take some quick fire comments for people who raise their hand? Firstly, we have Adela Drozdibok, who's got a hand raised. Adela.
Yes, thank you. That was a challenge with that last name. I know it always was, but you did it well. You did it well, don't worry. So one of the comments I really like when you started speaking about healthcare supply chains and food supply chains, they are really important and we see them as the most vulnerable ones. So I like that. However, I have recently been speaking with multiple supply chain managers here in Australia. They're suppliers or retailers in grocery supply chains, so they supply supermarkets. One of their main insights to me as a researcher was that they said fresh food is not such a big issue because people are not storing fresh food in big amounts. It's perishable. The biggest issue are the other products in supermarkets, such as baker's paper or stretch folio, or those packaging materials people use every day in their kitchen. And they started storing them increasingly. Now the issue is not only that they're hoarding that, and they suddenly need more supplies that are actually getting here from China. The biggest issue is that supplier will order more supplies able to sell to a retailer, but retailer won't be able to sell it later on because people already bought supplies for next year or so.
Sure.
So
yeah.
the big disruption is only going to come afterwards.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good comment, Adela, because and then I think that what we're seeing is that this issue of demand on the demand side related to hoarding is very variable. And there are some, whether they're cultural differences internationally, but I do know, certainly in the UK, it's being reported that people trying to hoard perishable products and a massive increase in terms of perishable products being wasted and thrown into waste because of it. So, yeah, so we do pay less attention, I think, in supply chain management, thinking about some of these variables on the demand side related to this. We've got some other comments relating to this dynamic flexibility. We've got a comment coming in from Jan Godsell from Warwick about supply chain. Sorry, somebody's been on the line.
The concept of budget airlines came a little later compared to the global market first.
Sorry, sir, can I call on Jan Godsell from Warwick, who's got a comment about supply chains needing to be dynamic? Are you there, Jan?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we've actually written some stuff about this. UK retailers were actually really good at dynamic flexibility. So our work looks at supply chain segmentation, and actually UK retailers are really good around their planning processes, understanding different demand profiles and putting the right size buffers in place. So for most products, they could actually respond to the demand spike. They couldn't quite get it to shelf quick enough, but they knew once demand settled down, there was stock in the supply chain and most things back on shelf. However, for things like ventilators, PPE, hand sanitizer, it was a different challenge because it's an unprecedented level of demand increase that the current network can't deal with. And in that situation, you require a more structurally flexible supply chain. Now, that builds on some of the stuff that Lisa was talking about, because fundamentally, our changes in manufacturing strategy over the last 30 years have not made our supply chains particularly structurally.
We're just losing you there, Jan. So, well, I think what the point that you're making, I think we've got that point. Thanks, that it's about flexibility and that we've been reducing that. And I think Tom Goldsby's got a comment as to reinforcing some of these issues about lean and what its role might be in this. Are you there, Tom Goldsby?
Yes, hello. First of all, congratulations to the organizers of this event. It seems like there's a lot of pent-up interest in convening, so thank you very much for bringing us all together. So I just wanted to respond to some of the opening remarks that Lisa Elrom offered, and she won't be surprised by this, so I think she's probably prepared to offer a rejoinder. But lean is coming under considerable duress these days, and I do find there's a bit of a distinction between lean in theory and lean in practice. I think a number of companies have taken a shortcut to lean by virtue of reducing inventories in hopes of nothing going wrong. And I think we can all predict what would happen even under normal circumstances if you just simply cut inventory levels down and hope for the best. Rather, those of us that try to implement the lean theory in its truest sense recognize that the inventory reduction is the reward for an improved, high-performing, robust, and yes, even resilient supply chain or series of processes. So I know I've been reading some of the comments that have been posted online as to whether or not just in case might supplant or replace just in time. And I think that, again, if we focus on process, I think a lot of the comments that Lisa as well as Barb offered in terms of recognizing, understanding the true capabilities of our supply chains, and again, just not taking shortcuts to some sort of lean bliss is critical. I try not to be cynical, but I do think that we are going to see the far side of this, and I think there will be some longer term thinking employed by organizations throughout some different varieties of supply chains. However, I do think that stockpiles of inventory would come under scrutiny. It has occurred to me that even ventilators and PPE have shelf life, and at some point you look at a stockpile and wonder, is that the best use of capital to have these things sitting around on the off chance that something might happen? For instance, in the next circumstance, it might be a cyber threat as opposed to a medical one. Would the same provisions necessarily get us through that kind of circumstance? And I think that Barb's comments about not focused on the specific kind of event in devising risk management strategies is really a very good one. Rather than thinking about what might happen in our supply base, just recognize that something could happen and that we need to be ready for whatever that eventuality just might be.
Yeah, I think, and that's a really good point there, Tom. Thanks very much, because I'm old enough to remember when we started to hear about just in time and started to get these messages from Japan, and a misunderstanding that went on about reducing inventory. And we are still trying to learn that reduction of inventory comes when you've actually improved all of the other parts of the process. So yeah, I think we're still trying to learn those, just using different names. But,
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We did have another comment of a raised hand. I don't know if you want to add to this, Fazlina Baderdine. Fazlina, you there? You raised your hand.
Thank you, Christine. Actually, my comment was related to also adding flexibility and agility to supply chains.
Great.
As we have seen, I think what we've observed in the supply chain is that the demand has shifted in the supply chain from more to domestic consumers away from industrial consumers. So, for example, even when we look at the case of toilet paper, which we've seen across the globe, there seem to be excess supply in the industrial supply chains, whereas there is a shortage of supply in the domestic consumers when they're looking to purchase. So my kind of question or comment here is, in the face of events such as this pandemic, how do we look at managing flexibility across supply chains? Looking at supply chains as networks of networks, because there seem to be excess supply in some places and loss of demand, shortage of supply in other places in the supply chain.
Yeah, thanks very much. You're very much speaking to me, my heart on that one, because I think we should be far more in our community at looking at these larger systems level issues. So thanks very much for that. It's a very good comment. We're moving in our discussions quite naturally into then thinking more about this issue of resiliency and risk management and how we might achieve that. And we've had many comments made already about this. Rohit Sharma and others have mentioned this topic is extremely important, and this issue that Tom was just raising about lean and whether just in time will become just in case. So let's hear a few more. We're leading into this. Let's hear some comments on that. Let's start with is Rohit Sharma available?
I do not think Rohit is here.
No. Okay. So do we have some other comments coming in? Let me take one on this point about resiliency and from Amy Shortman, which is thinking about then some of these technological issues related to this. Amy Shortman, are you there?
I am indeed. Hello, I'm from Cambridge. Hi. First of all, thank you very much. Amazingly organised with all these people. My hat goes off to you for setting this up. So yeah, I think that technology has a huge role to play in the demand planning and the security of the supply chain. What we're seeing is that we're almost on the kind of curve of embracing how we can bring together different data sources and aggregate them to not only protect product in flow and provide that kind of on-demand notification on products arriving so that warehouses, particularly in situations like this where we have reduced numbers of staff, can be aware of product coming in. But in addition, and if we take the US for an example, we can actually get down to sort of zip code level detail on particular areas, looking at the health of patients within that, the at-risk population, the number of ICU beds, the number of medics there. And we can overlay that with statistical data from the supply chain, such as ports closing, border crossing delays, to be able to provide the industry with a lot more intelligence that's actually really tangible and practical in order to keep their supply chains. The other thing that I would just like to mention is that criminals are very good at adapting to taking advantage of situations. So what we're also seeing is that the desire for certain products that maybe wouldn't have been so targeted before, such as PPE, when they know that there is an opportunity to sell on the black market, are being targeted. So just in terms of managing that sort of resilience and processes to protect your supply chain, even with products that might have not been so desirable before.
Thank you very much for that. It's a really important, big issue in terms of the technology that's available and how it's being used in different countries. We're seeing this, and you also raised then the issue that creates relating to corruption and how we can work to be able to protect when we're using some of these technologies. So we've got, there's a comment with his hand up about how we can maybe build some agility into this. It's coming from Jury Galandris. Are you there, Jury?
Yes, I'm here. Hi. Yuri from Canada, originally from Italy. So I see both sides of the pandemic, a relatively good one in Canada and a very bad one in Italy. My comment actually relates to somehow, in part, to what has been said now on our ability to adjust our mindset and our processes. I've been conducting a number of interviews in the past month, a couple of months, originally with a focus on the circular economy in the agri-food sector, or more recently on how these companies have been adjusting in the agri-food sector in Canada to the pandemic. And a pattern that I observed relates to the economies of scale versus economies of scope that some firms build. So a firm that leverages economies of scale usually look and refer to demand all the time and says, if I need to satisfy need X, what processes do I need to build to satisfy that demand? The scope economies are instead more focused on the supply side. So they say, I have X resources, what can I do with them? And so in the circular economy is much more, I do have X resources, these forms of waste, these forms of slacks and redundancies, what can I do with them? And these firms that I observed have embraced the circular economy in the past seem to be transitioning much more quickly and reacting much more quickly to the pandemic, because they realize that despite the pandemic, we still have quite an abundance of resources, maybe not what we want to have, but is there. And similar to thieves and the black market, they just say, you know, what can we do out of these resources that we have to satisfy emerging demands? So my question is more a comment and a question, if any of you have seen similar patterns in how firms are building agility through scope economies and leveraging waste, or what we call waste, which is actually not.
So we're coming around, and thank you very much for that, Yuri. As usual, a very multidisciplinary and helicopter view of a lot of these issues that you have integrated there. There's also the issues about existing supply chains, and there's a particular point being made relating to this about stress testing of these supply chains and about it being at the moment quite conventional. This comment's made by Mark Morris of Arif. Do you want to expand on that, Mark?
Hi, Christine. Thanks. Which comment did this relate to? Was it the?
You've made a lot of comments. Okay, so well, relating to this, what comment do you want to make? It's particularly relating the point that you were making about conventional stress testing, and several critical industries need to up their game. Was the point that you made? But please make a comment that you feel.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I did make a couple of comments, but thanks very much. I'm doing some work at the moment with industrial clients, and what I'm finding is that some of the environmental conditions that we use for stress testing supply chains just aren't keeping pace with the kind of realities of this kind of crises. And I think what I'm really interested in doing is trying to identify how we can improve those stress tests in the future. I think this comes down to identifying resilience-based factors that you can use to stress test supply chains. But I'm really interested to know from other people what their experience is. What I've seen so far is it's actually quite conventional based on traditional supply chain management practice.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're doing is collecting and gathering ideas and comments, and so we'll be able to then report on some of these, but we'll make a particular note that you're asking for to see if anybody else has got some other ways of doing this. That's great. Thank you very much. I would take a couple of quick comments for people with their hands up. Vasco Rodriguez, with your hand up. Are you there, Vasco?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Vasco.
Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. I have been working the last year or two doing research consultancy with Ocado with two colleagues, Paul Wang and Emra Demir, as well with Professor Joe Sarkis. And we are going to do research on the COVID-19 impact of how they manage their high demand, because the demand went from they being 5% of the market to 40% of the market online, or maybe 50. So, and including that vulnerable people needed to be assisted. Yeah. So from the supply chain perspective, there were bottlenecks from the supplier, their customer fulfillment centers, their local warehouses, but more importantly, they found that outsourcing transportation was not an option, especially on the last mile deliveries, because they didn't want to sacrifice their customer service. Yeah.
Okay, so if you could, Vasco, if you could then put some of those findings that you've got that's really useful from that research and post it, and we'll include some more detail on that. That's great, because we've got some other hands up that people want to make comments quickly.
It's okay.
Oh, thanks very much, Vasco. So we've got another hand up from Godfrey Mugarusi. Has got his hand up. What comment do you want to make, Godfrey?
Hi, everybody. My name is Godfrey, and thanks for this discussion, because I can see that perhaps there's a lot out there. I just want to tell you what my experience and what I've been trying to do, because I work a lot with nearshoring and offshoring type of decisions. But what is very interesting here is I work in Norway, but I'm originally from Uganda. And I asked one of my friends who works in the retail sector, 200 people, the company, And I actually asked him, I just went to ask to find out. I was very keen to understand this toilet paper theory, why in Norway there were no queues for toilet paper, but everybody else in the world was queuing. And James explained to me something very interesting. He said, occasionally, they, at this small company, they do supply chain stress tests. And I found this very fascinating because Mark has just talked about it right now.
Yeah.
And I think Barbara Flynn also talked about it, relating to how do you structure the supply chain network and to test whether this network fits into what would be flexible, what would be resilient in that context. And what I was wondering from everybody here is, perhaps, is it much more smarter, because now the discussion is about the supply chain? How about that we abstract the discussion more into ecosystems, a little bit much more broader? Because when we look at the supply chain, we don't take the helicopter view. You've talked about this, Christine, and we lose this ecosystem type of thinking in this context.
Loving it, loving the comment. And I think there's going to be quite a lot more reflection on the idiosyncrasies of different toilet paper supply chains, because it is one of the things that's very different internationally. But yeah, thanks very much for that, Godfrey. And if you do have any comments relating to ecosystem work, then please post them onto our board, that we can then share those within the report. We're trying to get hold of a guest speaker who I think is available, who's also going to share their views relating to response and recovery. And so Hervé Lejeanvre, I've probably completely mispronounced that again, Hervé, I'm sorry.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, are you there, Hervé?
Yes.
Please, let's hear your comment.
Yeah, no, I can just, share very briefly a few things. I've been, over the past 2 weeks, I've been interviewing 18 CPOs from multinational corporations in Europe, and basically asking them, what are your key immediate actions that you took? What were the next critical actions, and how are you going to be supporting the revised budget planning process? Really to try to understand what was special, and already doing some coding, there was some interesting point in terms of tensions. So the first one that was coming very strong was really trying at the same time to handle internal continuity, and at the same time trying to support as good citizens society. That was a strong one. This was something done very quick and in parallel. One thing that was interesting is we always talk about the product supply chain. We don't talk so much about the supply chain behind the white collars. Some companies I've been interviewing, they've been bringing back home tens of thousands of people. They've been delivering workstations at home to these thousands and tens of thousands of people, so they could continue in the ICT sector to support their client, for instance. So that was a very interesting aspects. Very impressed by how some of these companies that might be a bit more advanced than others in some ways, but they've been reorganizing their team very fast. Some of them were focusing on very short-term issues, looking at risk, and others were already anticipating some of the long-term perspective in terms of revisiting category strategies, looking at specific opportunities they would be seeing on the radar. In terms of the supply chain and relationship with supplier, they also had a sort of a dual approach, with some people dedicated to managing close relationship. So like they describe it as operational supplier relationship, with together with one member of the board having one or two meetings per day with some of the key suppliers, while other people would be looking more deep into the supply chain, what might be coming. And here, one of the big issues was shortage of labor. A lot of places. People have been migrating to get works. They've left. And one of the big unknown is shortage of labor deep in some supply chains. And the last point was interesting, was how they would be both preparing for risk. Some of them have been escalating their risk process right up to the level of the board of the company, because this is really getting a lot of attention. And they've been really happy to invest in the past in this type of practice. But others are really trying also, and the same are really trying to take advantage of the current fluidity in companies by, so one of the company, for instance, in luxury goods, they've already identified 200 actions that could be proposed as breakthrough that wouldn't be accepted in normal time, but because of the current fluidity in the organization, appetite to do things that they wouldn't do normally, they would be ready to push for the next stages.
Yeah, thanks very much. Those are some really interesting reflections from your discussions with CPOs. And I think, yeah, I agree in terms of focus. We've always been far more focused in the field on product supply chain. And some of these societal issues as well are profoundly important in a lot of these. So thank you very much for that contribution, Hervé. And you've also very nicely brought us on really to start to think before we then go on to look at this longer term picture post-COVID. We've just got one comment that we'd like to take from John Wilkerson about best supply chain practices. Are you there to make your comment, John?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, thanks.
Got it. My video's not there, so I'm here. Hey, my background is not academia. I did get my PhD in 2017 after doing consulting and working in supply chain for about 18 years. So during disaster planning, one project that I had, actually had two projects in disaster planning, particularly in healthcare, but we actually transitioned, the team and I transitioned from healthcare to looking at the supply chain overall. And there were four categories that you guys were talking about: social, four categories. One was social, the other is demand planning, the other is resources. And again, I mentioned before, we're talking about talent.
Yeah.
I'll just make some brief comments on because we're pressed for time. One is regarding demand. One of the issues that I found from practical experience is that demand never connects the dots with resources, talent, and also patients or wherever the mission is. Someone's got to take the step back, whether it's again, it just has to be local, but also in the state, regional, national level. Take a step back and coordinate all those resources, because it never works out. I've been through two of these. Not as large as what's going on worldwide, but I've been in two of these on a national level that it's very difficult. The other thing is the social part. You know, I've never been homebound in my life, ever in my life. And today I'm homebound since for almost 40 days. It's driving me crazy. But on the social side, when I look at social media, where I see some very intelligent people making irrational decisions to not follow rules, is just amazing. And that actually goes back to impact demand, cost, and a lot of things, and how long it takes for the recovery.
Yeah, so there's some really broad issues that we are going to have to deal with in response to that. Yeah, so thanks very much. And I think you're also raising a very good point that really does show international differences, that if you're in a federal state system, it's fundamentally different to if you're in a system where there's central control government over some areas, particularly health. So thanks very much for that, John. We need to, the time is flying by in this forum. So we really want to get to some points relating then to the real longer term and post-COVID issues relating to, some people have raised comments relating to restructuring and what we might do post-COVID. So we have some comments here raised by Graham Curry. Is Graham Curry on the line? No, we'll come back if you are on the line at some point, Graham, relating to points on restructuring. We've got some of the other issues that we did really want to get on in terms of post-COVID is getting to some of the management issues that John was just referring to, and other comments have been in terms of some of the more people issues, the skills, the delivery, suppliers, and also some people are raising issues about how the role of government in managing some of these. So let's take some comments from, do we have Charbel Chiapetta available?
Yeah.
Please, let me have your comments on that.
So thank you very much for organizing this. My question is about, the future of education and supply chain in this post-COVID era that we will be hopefully very soon. What kind of skills and knowledge we will need to emphasize so students will be equipped with what they need, or if things will just remain as they are now. So this is the question. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for that question. So we all need to be thinking in terms of with the academics, in terms of the courses that we're running and how we're raising then the knowledge base that we're giving to students, but also the practitioners. What type of education do they need their managers of the future to have? So I think that's a really good comment. So do we have people who have got comments to make about the impact on new skills that we're going to need? Do we have any comments coming in relating to new skills? I think we did have somebody was making a comment relating to this. Yang Zhang is one of the comments. Yang Zhang available? No, I think we'll move on to then some of the other postcards. But please carry on posting your comments, and we'll try to get to you to make some comments in relation to these post-COVID issues. So we also have comments relating to some of the delivery issues and the impact that this had on all of our last mile delivery. So we've had comments made by Vince Castillo. Is Vince Castillo available to expand on the comments?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I am here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks everyone for putting together this panel. My question was, I wanted to hopefully transfer a little bit of discussion about maybe some different types of industries. What industries are you seeing supply chains being the most resilient and being the least resilient? And what are some of the reasons why, or what might be some contextual reasons why those industries are either more or less resilient to this COVID-19 disruption?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so let's see if we can get some contributions into that. Let's get some thinking internationally relating to that. So we're going to throw a few more topics because we're conscious that we want to allow some time at the end of the forum to be able to really get your views on the next steps of what you would like this forum to be able to do next. So we have some of these post-COVID issues related to the set of people who have been making comments relating to public procurement and the role in this. And I think Jane Lynch is available online. Jane, do you have a comment to make relating to the management of public procurement, please? Jane, is Jane Lynch here?
Yes, I think she was. She's just muted. I'm going to unmute her. Go ahead, Jane.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Christine. Public procurement. Yeah, very interesting. I think from, so I'm based in Cardiff in Wales, UK. And I think what's been particularly interesting from a public procurement perspective is the commercial aspects and the way that procurement has taken a much more commercial view in the way that they're conducting the business at the moment, particularly in relation to house supplies. And what I think has been really quite refreshing is really how the Department for Procurement and the Department for Economy have been working together hand in hand in terms of stimulating and supporting the local market and the regional market to innovate and to optimize the opportunities that are becoming available. And what we've actually seen is some incredible innovations, which I've seen in the Zoom group chat have already been some examples. So, for example, gin distilleries supplying alcohol for hand sanitizers, Royal Mint prototyping and manufacturing visors within literally less than a couple of weeks. A furniture manufacturer now looking at producing the scrubs and the overalls. So, and a lot more collaboration between the universities and research centres as well. So it's really an all working hand in hand with government, government funded projects. So I think there's been some really positive developments, which hopefully we'll see what we can build on in the future.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks very much for that. And I think we're becoming very acutely aware in a short space of time of the profound differences between different territories and the ability of government in those territories to then take this orchestrating, coordinating role in this and then start to use government spending and government relationships with suppliers and with the supply market to be able to intervene. And that's just not possible in some cases. My US colleagues are very clear of the difficulties of doing that in a state system. So we're running out of time. We're just going to take a couple of quick hands up before we then try to get your views about where we go to from here. So I see Mark Green has got his hand up. Mark, what would you like to say?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah, I used to be in charge of global quality and scientific and regulatory affairs for international flavors and fragrances. We had like 35,000 ingredients that we had to worry about where they came from. So I'm sitting here thinking about this. If I was back in that role, what would I start doing? And it seems to me there's an opportunity for this group of people with the expertise that you have to facilitate something that I would try and go do. And the first thing I'd want to go do is go list the fundamental sources of disruption that could occur on a broad level: war, health, natural disaster, political upset, whatever, those things. The next thing I'd do is I'd work off of what Dr. Flynn talked about, geographical exposure. And I would very much rely on understanding this barrel versus pyramid thing that she talked about. Then the third thing I would do, because I'm working in a business where I've got to convince people who don't understand a lot of these things, I start working on the total cost, not the price, but the total cost of the impact versus doing nothing for each one of these scenarios. And what would that do to the business both in the short term and the long term? And then the fourth thing I would have to do, because a lot of the folks that I would be reporting up to would say, well, that's great, but the probability of that happening is incredibly small, and therefore, why should I be worried about it? Because I got to report to Wall Street next week. That kind of thing is, so given a sell-in of some sort to the folks that run the companies, what plans are appropriate to attenuate each of these kinds of scenarios so that we could begin to think about, because I was in charge of crisis incident management type stuff. And it strikes me that within the expertise of this group and the technology that's out there is that you could begin to facilitate putting together those kind of views to support the practitioners and the political leaders.
Well, thanks very much, Mark. Let's take those views. I think it's great. We'll take that really as a call to arms, and that moves us very neatly into then thinking about what this action agenda is. that the purpose of this is about. It's about us coming up with an action agenda, making some choices and decisions about what we want to do. So I think you've also gone full circle, Mark, back to our original speakers, which is it's great, very neat, thank you, to what Barbara was saying, and also very much then on what Gyeonggi was saying relating to thinking about this and preparedness. So preparedness, something that we've only really seen in the humanitarian and disaster management side, and less so in the more traditional supply chain management thinking and courses, etc. So what I'd like to do is I'd really like to now pull together some ideas from you all before we close in terms of what do we want to do, and we is all of us. We've just arrived in this forum today and we've shared some views. So what do we want to do about that? So I'd like to take some comments and some suggestions here from people about whether, firstly, let's start with practitioners who have joined us in terms of what the practitioners really think should be the imperative for what we should be doing in supply chain research and what we should be doing in terms of supply chain thinking and education. Do we have any practitioners who would like to put their hand up and to make some suggestions in terms of where we might take this discussion now? So if we don't have any immediate comments from practitioners, then let's widen that out to the whole forum, and let's start to brainstorm some ideas about where we might then focus our attention in this action agenda. So what bright ideas do we have, people?
Hi there, it's Mark Morris from Arab. I'm happy to contribute on this question.
Thank you.
Yes, I think what's clear to me is that we all work in very different sectors, and I work predominantly in the infrastructure and built environment sector. And I think that what would be really useful is actually having some common things that we can do across supply chain management that actually respond to the crisis, regardless of what sector that you work in. And I thought Bob Flynn's earlier comments were really useful about actually understanding your sub-tiers of supply chain, but also you do have to take a longer view in this kind of crisis and look after your supply chain. So I think things like accelerating payments, looking to speed up the flow of cash into the supply chain, those are all good things that I think we can all learn from. So I think that would be really useful to me, and I suspect others.
That's great, because that's given us some short-term day-to-day things that we could all be doing in supply chain. So looking after suppliers. But there's also a real long-term, more strategic issue, and one of the previous comments was very much about this strategic and structural view versus this more tactical view. And this more strategic view, long-term, then, and I think it relates also to the comments that were made related to ecosystems, comments that about understanding beyond the traditional view of supply chains, immediate supply chains, to really thinking about these broader supply ecosystems and taking care maybe of some of these. Where do we start with that? So we've got Ian Fraser has got his hand up. Would you like to make your comment, Ian?
Yes, thanks very much. And thanks particularly to the organizers for opening up this excellent and very fruitful forum. So I'm speaking both in a capacity as an academic and as a practitioner. I've been working for the last 3 to 4 years in the German automotive industry, working in a sustainable supply chain management capacity as part of their global procurement strategy. And previously you asked what sort of skills do we think as an SCM practice we need to be having more of looking forward. And the first thing that occurred to me was the ability to perhaps think slightly out of the box. So previous speakers mentioned an over focusing, almost a kind of over reliance on cost cutting, seeing procurement function purely as a cost center. And just speaking from my experience within the automotive industry, recently, at least in the company that I was involved with, there was a real interest in a return to localization of sourcing. And with increasingly global production and yet centralized, streamlined global procurement functions, there's been a tendency to go for the big fish, right? And then you have parts perhaps being partially produced in Europe, sent over to Asia for further processing, and then perhaps back to products in Europe, for example. And I think this return to localization of sourcing and procurement is, I think, whilst it was motivated from a cost perspective, it has some interesting potential moving forward. And one would be for resilience, so that those regions, for example, that are now recovering from COVID are no longer dependent on chains that bounce between continents, but also from a sustainability perspective, which I personally is my main focus, and I'm worried is going to get lost in this crisis times. But I think that moving forward, focusing on localization could have some really positive effects on sustainability in supply chain management. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much for those. Yeah, and yeah, I worry about what happens with our sustainability, our ethical supply agendas as well. We find. So we're just going to take one last hands up comment from Mahita. Mahita? No? Okay. So we're running out of time, and what we're going to be doing now is, before we bring this forum to a close, what we're going to do is, well, firstly, I would like to thank our speakers, Lisa Elrom, Barbara Flynn, and Yongyi Kovac. And I'd also like to thank our backroom puppet masters, Joe Sarkis and Wendy Tate, who have been rushing around backstage here and feeding all of your comments, etc. So thank you very much to those. Mostly I want to thank all of you for participating and spending your time during this difficult time. I know a lot of you are really busy, particularly the practice, so thank you very much for that. So we're going to be working on analysing, and we're going to present our initial findings back to you. We're going to try and do that within 2 weeks. We want something prompt, and we want then to be able to see what suggestions we might be able to make in that report for what we can do. But we are going to deliver what we promised, which is a report called An Action Agenda for Effective Post-COVID-19 Supply Chains. So thank you very much. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay well. There is a video available for you. I'm just getting some, this is like if you go through the gift store on the way out, there is a video available on YouTube for you to see, and in addition to the report. And it's the taped version of what this forum has been about. So that's available. So thank you again, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.